Some of the top economic minds were warning regulators that the economy was headed towards a complete collapse before the meltdown of 2008. And today, some of those same folks are warning us that our lack of effort is leading us down the same path of financial ruin. Joining me now to talk about this is Thom Hartmann, progressive talk show host and author of the new book, The Crash of 2016. Thom, the article is America on the Verge of Another Financial Collapse is just, of course, ties into your latest book. I don't think people understand some of the nuances to what's happening. This article, for example, talks about how banks now are borrowing from the government at 1% and then parking that same money in government treasuries at 3%. In other words, the government's giving them 1%, and then they're making money on the other end at 3%.
Yeah,
this is one of the small part, but lay out what you think are the fundamental parts of why this crash is imminent.
Well, because the fundamentals have not been fixed, and because we haven't gone a step beyond that and healed the damage that was done. When FDR came into office, you had absolute wreckage. I mean, the week he came into office in March of 1933, all the banks in America closed their doors. There's just pretty much all of them. I mean, it was just a total collapse. And so he pointed out, he said, there's all these people who've got these mortgages that they can't afford to pay. Now, back then, they were mostly 5-year mortgages with balloon payments. So he created an agency that bought those mortgages from the banks, turned them into 30-year notes, which cut the payments down to about a fifth of what they were. And over about a 40-year period, people paid that agency back. The government took about a 20% loss rate on those loans. And even at that, we made a profit. The government made a profit, saving individual homeowners. He said, to hell with the banks. We're going to save the homeowners. And the banking industry slowly got back together. As you pointed out, Pap, right now, people are scratching their heads. How could it be? Bernie Sanders and Dennis Kucinich got the Fed audited in 2008, and what they discovered was that the Fed had passed out over $30 trillion. The GDP of the United States is $15 trillion a year. The Fed had passed out over $30 trillion to banks, to rich people, to corporations all over the world. But at least $20 trillion of it was here in the United States. And they say, well, if the Fed passed out $20 trillion, how come we didn't get fixed? Well, the problem is the idea that was pitched by Tim Geithner and Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson and all these economic neocons was give the money to the banks. The banks will loan it to people. They'll give more favorable loan rates. If you give money to the banks it's less than 1%, at 0.3%, 0.4%, 1%. Give the banks that money, and that banks will then be very, very happy to loan that money to homeowners at 3% or 4%, very low interest rates, to refinance bad loans, to even take write-offs on some of the principal, all these kind of things. In fact, there were some programs to incentivize banks to do that. And the bank said, screw that. We're going to sit on the money and make a fortune.
Thom, wasn't part of it also that we used to be a country that built things? We used to be a manufacturing company. And the idea was give banks money and we'll expand that issue. We will actually increase employment by building things like we used to and by manufacturing things rather than shipping them out of the country. Instead, we make these, you call it financialization, which is these fictions, these bank creations like swaps and CDOs and derivatives. That's where most of the money has gone, if it's been spent at all, isn't it? Productivity?
Yes, absolutely. When Reagan came into office, about 35% of our economy was manufacturing. Now it's between 11 and 15%, depending on whose numbers you're using. When Reagan came into office, banking was around 9% of our economy. Now it's around 35% of our economy. Banking doesn't make anything except for billionaires on Wall Street. And this whole financialization is crazy. And so, part of this is because of our trade policies. We used to have protectionist trade policies, which kept manufacturing in the United States. But another part of it is, once again, the theory was we will give the banks really, really cheap money, and they will lend that money out to companies, which will expand their manufacturing operations, hiring more people, stimulating the economy. The problem is that this was an extension of Reagan's supply-side economics. This theory assumes that if you build more factories and make more stuff, people will buy it. The reality is that economies, and Adam Smith laid this out in 1776 in his book, The Wealth of Nations, and his more important book, frankly, A Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith laid this out. Demand is what drives economies. Demand, people going into stores and saying, I want to buy something, which then causes the store owner to have to buy it from the wholesaler, who has to buy it from the manufacturer, who has to hire people to make it.
But they have to have wages to do that.
That's correct.
Tom,
the
you
thing
have
that
to
creates demand is wages. Wages is the 90% key component to demand.
Tom, one thing that you always hear about the threat of inflation, but honestly, when you analyze the things that's gotten us into the worst shape is stagflation. That's where, on both ends, the American public is getting it. Explain that a little bit. The argument about, you keep hearing, as amazing as it is, the notion, gee whiz, we've got to keep these interest rates down because we're so afraid of inflation.
Right.
And really, the argument, we have to keep these interest rates down because the banks own us.
Yeah. Part of this comes from a weird theology that's in Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged, which is that a currency that's backed up by the wealth and prosperity and good faith of a nation isn't as good as a currency that's backed up by gold, which is demonstrably false. But the other part is that people don't understand what causes inflation. The inflation of the 1970s, which led to stagflation, you had both inflation and a recession, a small recession at the same time. They called it stagflation. And really what caused that inflation was a lack of essential goods. This is what drives inflation. There's two kinds of inflation. There's inflation that's intentionally caused by a government debasing their currency. The only example of this in the 20th century that you can find that's really well documented, it was Germany after World War I. After World War I, at the Treaty of Versailles, and John Maynard Keynes fought this tooth and nail and said, this is crazy, you're going to cause World War II. After World War I at the Treaty of Versailles, the winning countries got together and said, we're going to punish Germany. They have to pay us back 2 trillion Deutschmarks. So Germany said, okay, cool. We have to pay you back 2 trillion Deutschmarks. We will make it so that 1 trillion Deutschmarks is enough to buy a loaf of bread. Here's your 2 trillion Deutschmarks. And that's what they did. They intentionally debased their currency so that they could meet the requirements of the Treaty of Versailles. That set up Hitler and the World War II. That happens so rarely that, maybe 4 times in the last 4 centuries you can find examples of that, even in small countries. It just almost never happens. So the thing that actually causes the more common forms of inflation, like we had in the United States in the 1970s, like you have in Zimbabwe right now, where the inflation hit almost 10,000% a couple of years back, is shortage of critical materials. In Zimbabwe, it was food because they had just a disastrous farm policy. In the United States, it was oil when the Arabs declared an embargo on our oil during the Six-Day War and the subsequent, our subsequent support of Israel over the Arabs. And when that oil got cut off, the price of oil went up, right? Supply goes down, price goes up. And when the price went up, because oil is used by virtually every dimension of our economy, inflation happened. That's what causes inflation. And you deal with that by dealing with the commodity, the demand for the commodity. We should have, and Jimmy Carter correctly did, by the way, go back and listen to his speeches in 1978 and 79 about energy. We needed to move to a solar economy immediately. And Carter put into place in 79 a solar bank that he said by the year 2000, 20% of our electricity would be generated by electricity nationwide. It would have, too, if Reagan hadn't dismantled it.
Tom, I think your Crash of 2016 might be one of the most important books out there that not to read it is not to understand what's getting ready to happen to you and your children and their grandchildren. I think it's so well done.
Thank you.
It's just